Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Libby Lenkinski, Vice President for Public Engagement at New Israel Fund. We're going to give it just another minute as people join and get situated in the Zoom room. So bear with me as we wait for just another 30 seconds or so. It's nice to see so many familiar names. I want to say faces, but I can't see you. I can only see your names. But we're being joined by people from all over the country and the world. When we invited people to join this particular webinar today, I don't think we were expecting the level of interest that we saw in the RSVP with hundreds. We broke 1,000 pretty soon after our first email. So we understand that this topic of really exploring what the Israeli government is doing in the West Bank while the headlines are so focused, and rightfully so, on Gaza, there's a lot of other actions underway. And so we're going to talk about all of that. I do see that people are still joining, but I'm going to go ahead and bring us into our conversation because we have a lot to cover with some really esteemed speakers joining us. So I'm going to officially start us on today's webinar. My name is Libby Lenkinski. As I said before, I'm the Vice President for Public Engagement at the New Israel Fund, and I'm really grateful and honored to have the opportunity to moderate today's conversation on this really timely and important issue. Today's webinar is co-presented by ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, OFEK, the Israeli Center for Public Affairs, and Breaking the Silence. And it has been a while that we've been wanting to really hold an in-depth conversation about the West Bank. The situation there is complex and evolving, and we really do want to keep shining a light on what's happening there, even as the war in Gaza, with all of its horrors and pain that are affecting Israelis and Palestinians, with hostages still being held in Gaza and an endlessly rising death toll of Palestinians. We can't understate the suffering that's happening there. And so it's been hard to focus attention on other important areas like the West Bank, but the situation there remains as urgent as ever, and is also escalating. As you know, the fundamentalist right-wing government of Israel is not waiting for the war to end. And while all of our eyes are on Gaza, they are actively using the war as a pretext to further their agenda in the West Bank, with potentially devastating consequences for peace and justice for Palestinians and for Israelis. They're expanding settlements, expelling Palestinian communities, and technically or bureaucratically actualizing annexation. So all of this is aimed at what Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has called voluntary emigration. And what he means by that is really ethnic cleansing, erasing Palestinian presence in key areas of the West Bank and aiming to reshape the map in ways that would block any future peace or Palestinian state. So while a negotiated agreement could bring an end to the bloodshed by entrenching settlement expansion and effectively annexing the West Bank, the current Israeli leadership is putting Israel on a path to constant war, not to mention undermining any possibility of a two-state solution or a peaceful resolution. So I'm here with 4 of NIF's key partners and grantees. Yesh Din, OFEK, ACRI, and Breaking the Silence have recently released a report in English on the right wing's efforts, some of which I just described. And the report gives some critical insights into the strategies and action that the government is using to entrench occupation and annexation at this time. I'm honored to host 3 of Israel's most important human rights and civil rights experts and activists, Rabbi Noa Sattath, attorney Michael Sfard, and Yehuda Shaul. Each of these leaders brings unique expertise and experience, and I'm excited to talk to them about this issue. I will share their bios extensively, and each of them could really hold a day-long seminar for us, and we would still leave wanting to learn more, but I'm going to keep it brief. We're going to talk about what's happening in the West Bank right now, the recent ruling from the International Court of Justice, and the changes to how Israel is administering the West Bank and developing Area C, and how organizations and activists are responding. We as NIF have made significant investments in blocking annexation efforts and more generally blocking the fundamentalist right. And we're committed to supporting those on the ground who are defending human rights. If you want to submit a question, you can do it at any point using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'm gonna do my best to weave those questions in throughout the call. Later on in the call, we'll be joined by our dear friend, International Council member, Rabbi Sharon Brous in LA, and she'll be offering some closing remarks and reflections on what we've discussed. Lastly, look out for an invitation to join us on October 7th for a call with NIF leadership to reflect and commemorate this last year, and be in community with each other. So without further ado, I'm going to announce our speakers and get us started. Michael Sfard is an attorney specializing in international human rights law who represents numerous Israeli human rights organizations and peace groups like Yesh Din, Peace Now, Breaking the Silence, and Human Rights Defenders Fund, as well as Palestinian communities and Israeli and Palestinian activists. He regularly argues cases before Israel's High Court of Justice, and he is the author of The Wall and the Gate, Israel, Palestine, and the Legal Battle for Human Rights. He's also my first teacher on these issues and remains my own personal mentor to this day. Rabbi Noa Sattath took the helm of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, in November 2021. Noah is an ordained Reform rabbi and spent the previous 11 years as executive director of the Israel Religious Action Center, IRAC, where she was responsible for leading the organization's public strategy regarding religion and state, gender equality, and the fight against racism. Noah has been a partner in leading social justice struggles, especially the struggle against the exclusion of women and against the election of racist candidates running for Knesset. Prior to Iraq, Noah served as executive director of the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance, where she aided in the historic move to lead the first Pride March in the city of Jerusalem. Noah also served as executive director for MEET, an organization that uses technology to develop the joint leadership of young Israelis and Palestinians from Israel and the West Bank. Yehuda Shaul was brought up in a Jewish Orthodox family in Jerusalem. As a teenager, Yehuda studied in a yeshiva based in the West Bank settlement of Ma'ale Michmash. I didn't know that. He began his military service in March 2001 as an infantry command soldier and later became commander during the Second Intifada until March 2004, with 2 years spent in the West Bank. Immediately after his service, Yehuda founded Breaking the Silence, together with other Israeli soldiers from his unit, and served as co-director until 2019. In 2020, Yehuda left Breaking the Silence and together with Dana Golan, co-director from Breaking the Silence, founded OFEK, the Israeli Center for Public Affairs. Yehuda remains with Breaking the Silence as a board member. I should also say my first ever trip to Hebron was guided by Yehuda, and it remains a real turning point for me in my political understanding and my activist understanding, as I know many, many people on the call have shared that kind of experience with Yehuda or his colleagues from Breaking the Silence in Hebron and in other places. Michael, okay, let's start with you. Could you please provide some background on what this government aims to achieve in the West Bank? And from your perspective, what have been the most significant policy, administrative, and legal changes that this government has made to implement that vision?
Well, so first of all, thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Libby, and thank you to the NIF for organizing this. It's extremely important that our circle of colleagues, supporters, our community will be versed with what is happening. And unfortunately, I don't think the media is providing enough context and enough depth in covering what's happening in the West Bank. Now, of course, I could talk a lot of time about what's going on in the West Bank, but I would like to concentrate on the bureaucratical, technical, legal changes that this government is introducing. But before that, I just want to pick up on what you said, Libby, in your opening remarks. And this is something that has to be said quite clearly. We have a government that has large sections that are openly advancing Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. They are openly advancing ethnic cleansing, whether they call it, wanton immigration or any other name. The idea is to create pressure that would make people leave, people who are not Jewish, Palestinians who are stateless. I don't know where they want them to leave. I don't know where they think they could reside, but that's the idea. That's what they want in Gaza. That's what they want in the West Bank. And this government has adopted several strategies in order to curb any kind of Palestinian development and actually push the Palestinians into their build-up enclaves and making their areas of presence constantly shrinking through. And as I said, there are many methods that this government has adopted, including support for militias, for very violent gangs that are doing that day in and day out. You can see just from today the video of 13 young settlers going into a Palestinian elementary school with clubs, hitting, beating teachers and pupils. And all of this is done with complete impunity. Not a single violent settler has been arrested or detained. Palestinians are constantly being detained in these kind of events. So I'll leave that to Yehuda and Noah to delve into this more in detail, and I will go on to talk about the immense changes, the revolutionary changes that the current government is introducing in the structure of the Israeli domination over the West Bank. And this has to be acknowledged, that this government, when it came into power at the beginning of 2003, it pledged to carry out two constitutional revolutions, not one. One, we all know, one was under the limelight. One, Israelis by their hundreds and thousands and maybe even millions went out to the street to push back, and that is the judicial overhaul, the attempt that is still ongoing to change the character of the Israeli governance system and to peel away all the democratic traits that it has through creating an autocratic system of government. But that was not the only revolution or constitutional revolution that this government decided to carry out. The second one was indeed regarding how we administer the West Bank. And in order to understand the change, and in this case, the government has managed to carry out the overhaul. In order to understand this change, I'll go to the basics of what an occupation is. An occupation is a territory that was captured by foreign army, foreign military power, and is being, under international law, is being administered temporarily until such time when a consensual permanent status of that territory is decided through one of the means that international law provides to solve international conflicts, negotiations, arbitrations, adjudication, etc. So Israel has denied since 1967 that the West Bank is an occupied territory in the sense this concept has under international law, but yet it also conceded that it will administer it under the rules of belligerent occupation because there are no other rules that can be applied to the territory. And for 56 years, until last year, until this year, Israel has administered the territory in the way that international law envisages an occupied territory being administered, through a separate entity of government, in this case the Israeli army, that has all the powers of the executive, judiciary, and the legislator of the government that is no longer there. It is not a sovereign, it is a temporary administrator, and thus it has limited powers over the territory. And yet, not the Israeli government or the government of the occupying state directly administers the occupied territory, but rather this, in this case, the Israeli army, a separate entity, which, and that separation creates a buffer between the Israeli citizens who vote and are elected and are and influence, of course, government policy, and the organ that is administering the territory. Of course, we have, as Israelis, an indirect influence over what's going on in the West Bank because our military is subject to governmental control, and the government orders the army what to do and what not to do. And yet, there are many issues where the government cannot coerce the army, for example, to select a specific person for a specific position in the authority that runs the West Bank. Or policies are being governed by military considerations rather than other considerations. The lawyers that provide legal advice to the authority that administers the occupied West Bank are military lawyers who are trained to accept that the normative framework is international law. Now, this is not all well, and I have made a career out of criticizing the army, how it distorted international law, how it exploited certain powers and abused certain powers. But nevertheless, there was this buffer between the Israeli government and the interests of the Israeli society as the Israeli government understands and interprets it, and what is going on the ground in the West Bank, what policies are chosen, what practices are being carried out, what norms are being adopted by the ruler of the West Bank, the military commander. Now, of course, the settlers hated that situation. Because that means they're not living in Israel. They're not living in an area where Israeli governmental authorities are running the show, but rather in a military governed territory. That's one. Second, they wanted their political power to be more effective than it already is by controlling directly the policies, the practices, and the norms that are applied to the West Bank. Bezalel Smotrich, in his negotiations with Netanyahu, forming this government, has managed to get a commitment from Netanyahu that this will be completely changed, that the army as a governing authority will no longer control and administer the territory when it comes to civilian affairs. It will only remain as a ruling authority on security issues. And so last May, the military commander has signed an order which transferred all the administrative powers from the army basically to an apparatus that is civilian, that is situated in the Ministry of Defense, and that is answering to Smotrich. So inside the Ministry of Defense, Smotrich created a small outpost, a ministry within the ministry, and this outpost now governs all the civilian affairs of the West Bank. That means that the settlers now control directly and with no buffer of an army or anything else everything that happens in the West Bank, and even the legal advisory that was in the army was transferred to the Ministry of Defense. And so the legal advisors that now provide the interpretation of what kind of powers Smotrich has over the West Bank, well, no one offered me the job. The people who are now legal advisors come from Kohelet Forum, come from Regavim, come from Chonenu, all the satellite movement of the Israeli right wing. I'll end with saying this formative change is an annexation, because that means that Israeli sovereignty has been stretched to cover the West Bank, and now Israeli citizens who vote and are elected are deciding on everything that happens in the West Bank. It's not just a theoretical issue. It means now that there is absolutely no barrier to expansion of settlements, to confiscation of land, massive confiscation of lands, and to disinheritance of Palestinians in any imaginative way they will choose to do. I'll stop here to allow my colleagues, but this is a very complicated issue. I tried to simplify it.
Thank you, Michael. You know, when I'm listening to you talk about what is happening already with this government, I'm reminded of a few years ago, Daniel Sokach and Mickey Gitson and I went on a trip in the West Bank with Yehuda that was like exploring a new approach to telling the story decade by decade. And in that trip, Yehuda, you said, when we were like, okay, so this is what happened over the last 4 decades, what will happen next? And you said this. And I was like, that's really dark, man. Like, if that will happen, that's really dark, that they will be able to take over ministries and make these kinds of changes using the state's bureaucracy. And you did identify that as like what they were trying to do, and they are accomplishing it. And I want to turn to you and ask, like, so we kind of heard on the government side from Michael, but what does that look like in terms of the impact on the ground? Like, what would we see if we were to travel with you there today?
So yeah, it's I'll just join Michael with thanking you and everyone at the NIF for putting this together. I think as Michael said, this government has in a way a revolutionary element in it, but it also has an evolutionary, it's both. Meaning some issues when we talk about the West Bank are kind of like more of the same, but just in a completely different level of acceleration. And some are revolutionary elements. And Michael spoke a little bit about the revolutionary. I'll start maybe with the evolutionary, with the more of the same, and then I'll get to more revolutionary things that this government has done. But first, to keep in mind, ultimately the goal is 1 million settlers in the West Bank. That's kind of like the headline for us, for this government, in order to understand this government. So obviously, we're not going to talk about everything, but just telegraphically, few of the important points. The government basically changed the procedure of advancement of planning, of expansion of existing settlements, housing units, and retroactive approval of some outposts as neighborhoods of existing settlements. And now, basically, Bezalel Smotrich has the control over this procedure. About 70 outposts were de facto retroactively approved. In a way, 70 new settlements. And the way they've done it is they created a new legal category, so to speak, an outpost that is in the process of approval. And the second that is done, there should be no enforcement against illegal construction there. And the government can give budgets, infrastructure, and everything, basically de facto approving 70 new settlements in 1 second. We're talking about a peak of advancement of housing units in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. A peak of declaration of state land, which is one of the ways that the Israeli government steals Palestinian land by misusing Ottoman laws from hundreds of years ago. We're talking about a peak of demolitions of Palestinian houses and structures, mainly in Area C, but also in B and we'll talk about it soon. We're talking about peak of settler violence, of attacks. If you look at the UN data on settler violence in 2021, we're talking about around 1 attack in average per day. 2022, 2 attacks per day in average. 2023, up to October 7, 3 attacks per day. After October 7, it peaks to 7 attacks averagely per day, and then goes down, and settles basically on about an average of 4 attacks per day, which is now in the last almost year. We're talking about a peak of obviously settler violence, and the demolitions lead to expulsion of Palestinians, the displacement of Palestinians. So we're talking about around 19 entire Palestinian communities being forcibly transferred since October 7, and a couple even before. These are numbers we haven't seen in the West Bank since the few months after 1967. That's just to kind of put things in context. Or February 72 in northern Sinai, when there were about 6,000 to 20,000 Bedouins displaced in order to make way to the Yamit settlement block. That's how far I need to go in history to get to these, numbers of Palestinians being expelled from their homes and lands. Obviously, budgets play a major role here, and we can spend the entire evening talking about how more and more money goes into settlements and outposts. But I think the most important thing to mention here is that as part of the next 5-year plan for transportation infrastructure of the State of Israel, about 20% of the entire budget of the State of Israel for paving roads is going to go to settlement highways. And that is a crucial thing. People, I think, are less aware of that. We tend to think of settlement expansion as counting housing units on top of hills, but we tend to forget that that's the end of the process of development. It starts with land allocation, planning, infrastructure, water, electricity, sewage, roads, and especially when we're talking about a situation where about 60% of workforce and settlements until today commute daily to Israel. So majority of the settlements are basically suburbs. Infrastructure is key to expansion of the settlements. So after talking about all of this massive development and settlements on the ground, and basically end displacement of Palestinians, think of it as kind of like both sides of the same coin, of advancing Israeli annexation. I want to talk about one of the revolutionary elements that this government is pushing through, and that is what I would title as part of undoing Oslo. For many, many years, the settlers have been running a campaign over a decade and a half that the Palestinians are taking over Area C. The about 60% of the West Bank that is under complete control of Israel, from the days of Oslo. As if there is a problem that the Palestinians are taking over Area C. It's ultimately supposed to be a Palestinian state, It's as if, you're complaining that the fish are taking over the sea. But put that aside. In the last few years, we've seen the settlers basically change their terminology. from discussing Palestinian takeover of Area C, hence we need to demolish, quote unquote, illegal construction of Palestinians in Area C. Now they're talking about the campaign over the open areas. So, and that comes out of the idea that the understanding, Area C we have already. Now the fight is about A and B. Because if we continue the fight only to Area C, we are reinforcing the paradigm of Oslo. And the idea that Palestinians should be allowed to expand and develop in Area A and B together, almost 40% of the West Bank, that's unacceptable for them. For them, Palestinians needs to be contained not only to A and B, but to the built-up areas within A and B. And all the open spaces, being at A, B, or C, should go to Israel. And that is something that Smotrich is trying to push this government as a matter of policy. And the way he is trying to push it is Israel operates today in A and B for security purposes, basically, for security needs. It doesn't follow through with demolitions for administrative reasons, but for security, it goes into A and B with thousands of incursions, via the Israeli military into Area A, definitely to B, where the IDF is present. So the idea now is to redefine what security is, to quote unquote national security, where Israeli contiguity and Palestinian fragmentation becomes the national security of Israel. And under that title, we shall be able to go into Area B and A and basically demolish Palestinian development and expansion into the open areas. We've seen already in some areas, most notably the decision by the Israeli cabinet to allow the enforcement of planning and construction laws by the IDF in what is called the agreed upon nature reserve, which is about 3% of the West Bank, which is Area B, but the nature reserve. And the complaint is that the Palestinian Authority doesn't enforce the planning and construction laws there and protects the nature reserve. So the IDF is now intervening and starting to hand out demolition orders and planning to carry out demolitions there. So we start to see this idea of demolition and expansion breaking out only from Area C. Hence I gave the title, The Undoing of Oslo. Anyway, I think I've spoken too much because we can really talk for hours about what this government has done, but hopefully that is a bit,
I think I speak not just for myself, but we could all listen to you for hours. I mean, it's I'm moving on only because you stopped, not because I thought it was too much. But I am seeing a bunch of questions coming up in the Q&A that actually point me directly to what I wanted to talk with you, Noa, about, which is IKAR is broad in the issues that it works on. I know this because I worked there for 4 years, and my alma mater. And I miss working there as well. But I think like there's some questions in the Q&A, and I also wanted to ask from your perspective, which works on a lot of justice issues in Israel and including in the occupied territories. How do those relate right now? I mean, we are seeing protests in Tel Aviv and other places in Israel. They don't seem to be about this. They do seem to be about the hostages and the war. But is this on the agenda? How is it related to other things that Israelis are caring about right now, or that IKAR is working on more broadly?
So I think we're seeing two models of an anti-democratic takeover. A lot has been written and discussed about the judicial overhaul, which really didn't follow the playbook of anti-democratic takeovers that we've seen in Hungary and in Poland and in Southern America, because right up front, the anti-democratic leaders very openly discussed their plan and their agenda, and they laid out the entire plan, and that caused a huge wave of resistance in Israel, which is so far successful in delaying many elements of that plan. But we're also seeing the settlement overhaul, which is another regime change. And that is really much more like the Hungarian playbook, where they initially, at the beginning of the government, they announced their intention to solidify the control of the Jewish people over the entire land. But ever since then, they're doing very incremental, very bureaucratic, very slow changes, always saying, no, this is nothing. It's not really anything important. And then you wake up in this Hungarian scenario where the system is completely different and you didn't know how it happened. And so it is very much like that. And so the protest movement that we are seeing in Israel, in all honesty, has not been very interested in the occupation from the get-go. But I think that the awareness, that's why we published the report, is because the awareness of what is happening and what it means, it is, Michael and Yehuda are the most brilliant speakers, and it is so complicated to understand what is going on. And the majority of Israelis are completely unaware. And so I think that the majority of Israelis, certainly the Israelis that are protesting in the streets, feel that this is a horrible time. They're not paying much attention to what is going on in the West Bank. If anything, they're paying attention a little bit to the war in Gaza. And then there's this other sector of Israeli society, which, as per their experience, they are living in times of miracles. That's what the Minister of Orit Struk said, that this ability to suddenly take over without any boundaries is a dream come true for them. Now, I think that the majority of Israelis, certainly the vast majority of protesters, are against that, but they are not speaking out against it right now, and they're not aware of it. It's not being covered widely on the news. The news is extremely focused on Israeli politics. And just to connect the points, I think that I want to talk about two trends. Right, one is the judicial overhaul. One of its key purposes is to serve the settlement overhaul, right? The settlement movement is the one behind the judicial overhaul. It's the support for the overhaul is not in the Likud areas of the underprivileged cities in Israel. It's in the settlements. And the reason they're doing it is that they see the Supreme Court as one of the checks and balances against their never-ending control of the West Bank, which is why they want to do it. And the second is, if we want to look broadly at what is happening, I think we're seeing a complete change in the use of force doctrine on all levels, right? We're seeing it in Gaza very clearly. We're seeing it in the West Bank with the unrestrained violence against Palestinians by settlers. We're seeing it against prisoners. We're seeing it against demonstrators. We're seeing it against the media. In every different element of Israeli society, there's more and incredibly excessive force that is being used. And the West Bank is part of that picture.
Yeah. Can I ask, this is from the Q&A. And I will ask you to start, Noah, and then Michael and Yehuda, you can jump in as well. But like, first of all, how can it be that the average Israeli doesn't know about this? And is the media covering it and people are just consumed with grief and anxiety about the war? Is it that the media isn't covering it? Is it happening in hidden? Like, what people are very curious about that. And also, like, when is there going to be an election? And is there any chance that this can be stopped by electing new parties, new people? That's a really big question. I kind of want each of your bite-sized answer because it's not really what this call is about, but people are asking and I get it.
So in terms of the protest movement in general, IKAR's major donors in Israel is a psychiatrist. And before the war, in the height of the protest movement, he asked for a meeting with me and said that he as a psychiatrist and me as the director of IKAR have a similar role, which was pretty surprising to me. And then he said that he as a psychiatrist has to meet people who have experienced a terrible emotional crisis, anxiety or depression, and all they want is just to go back to before the crisis happened. And he has to tell them there's no going back. You have to look at the issues that you've been avoiding and suppressing and ignoring in your psyche in order to move forward. And I think that in the protest movement, it's a little bit like that. There's something very nostalgic in the protest movement, and it just wants to go back to before the previous elections. And it's our role as leaders in civil society to kind of remind people that you can't really protest about democracy without looking at the foundational problem in Israeli democracy, which is the occupation, which really challenges the whole question of Israeli democracy. In terms of the issues, they are not being widely covered in terms of what is happening in the West Bank. I think Israelis are paying attention to settler violence, and there is more and more attention to the dangers in that and to the horrors in that, much less so than to Israeli Jewish pain, but there is acknowledgement of that. But that is to the kind of the on the ground, on the surface issues, less so to the bureaucratic legal changes. And I think that the question of how we find empathy during mourning is a very big question, and the absence of the hostages makes the mourning very intense all of the time without the ability to process and move forward, which is also hindering it. About the elections, I will say that one of our key issues is to track everything that's going on so that we can hopefully walk it back in a different government.
Anything to add to that before I move on to some more international?
So I just want to add, I mean, everything you both said in your question, Libby, and in Noah's answer is correct. I mean, it's all of the above. It's not enough coverage. It's very shallow coverage when there is coverage. It's grief and the attention is on other things. But there's one more thing here, and I think Americans would relate to it. I'm sorry, but I don't remember which philosopher said that, but there are two types of censorship. One is stifling speech by creating silence. That's the regular, when we think of censorship, that's what we think. But there's another one, creating a lot of noise. When there's a lot of noise, you don't hear anything. And this is what we Israelis are going through. And to some degree, you Americans went through in the first Trump presidency. There's constantly stuff going on. Everything is so crazy. Everything is so unbelievable.
Chaotic.
Everything is so, and then you lose touch of what is important and what is not. You don't know what to concentrate on. And this is what we're experiencing here for a lot of time, but definitely after October 7th. And when it comes to the Palestinians, they always work, they're not a constituency. They can't vote. They are weightless politically. So they're, from the get-going, they are in the lower parts of our mind.
Mm-hmm. So I want to stick with you for a minute and zoom out internationally, because in these months, we have seen rulings and actions by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice related to these issues. Among the things that haven't been reported as widely as one would expect, as the headlines are subsumed with other things, but I think are really important. Can you, especially, I mean, I think so, or I don't know, I want to ask you, what's happening with the ICC and the ICJ, and is it important? And then we're going to ask a question about what can Americans do. Everybody on the call who's listened to NIF webinars before know that this is My favorite thing that happens on every NIF webinar is that the first questions, and indeed this time too, you had hardly even started talking and people were already saying, what can American Jews do? How can we help stop this? What can we do other than give money to the groups and through NIF? So we're going to get to that, and Rabbi Sharon Brous will help us answer that, as well as somebody who has found lots of ways of stepping into that fray here. But Michael, talk to us first about the ICC and the ICJ as it relates to settlers, settlements, annexation, etc.
So, I like it. You're asking an expert on international law. Is international law important?
I know, because I know you're going to say yes.
No, I'll be as neutral as I can and unbiased as I can when I'll say that after 57 years of occupation, when the ground where the questions of regarding the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is being governed by certain actors which are quite permanent. The Americans are an actor, a major actor, the Europeans, of course, the Arabs. Palestinians are a very weak actor, but they are an actor. Economy is an actor. The military power and military lobbies are an important actor. After 57 years, for the first time, a new dude has made an appearance, and that is international law. We heard about international law in the past, but we never saw it on the ground. And suddenly, in the last few weeks and months, it made a real appearance. There is a new actor. It's not a decisive one. It doesn't, that actor doesn't have, that player doesn't have the decisive power, but it is a new one, and it does have much power. Israel experiences now a legal avalanche with two major proceedings in the International Court of Justice, the South African lawsuit alleging Israel commits the crime of genocide, the advisory opinion that the ICJ has issued on July 19th, which I'll say a word about in a moment, and of course, the arrest warrants that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has asked the pretrial chamber to issue. Each of these cases have huge impact, not only when they themselves are ruled, but also because they have an impact on domestic courts around the world, who are now being asked, should we restrict our government's ability to sell weapons to Israel? Is Israel's human rights record such that we should be very wary of providing assistance to their military efforts, and so on and so forth? The ICJ advisory opinion is an extremely important piece of ruling by the International Court of Justice. Basically, it asserted three assertions. One, that Israel's presence in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem is unlawful. It is unlawful because Israel has abused the powers it was given by international law as a temporary administrator of the occupied Palestinian territory. It abused those powers in order to frustrate the very purposes and objects of this field of law. Instead of making sure that the rights of the people are protected and the territory is kept for such time as we could have a consensual agreement on permanent status. Instead of that, Israel has used those powers to perpetuate its domination, to extend its sovereignty over the territory, to steal it, basically. So that's one assertion by the court. The second is that Israel is annexing the territory. This is a fundamental violation of the probably most important prohibition of international law in the post-Second World War era. The post-Second World War era, the modern international law is based on a novelty, and the novelty is that use of force in international relations is prohibited. After 1945, on the ashes of two world wars and one Holocaust, humanity has decided to outlaw wars, not completely, wars of aggression. And in order to do so, it created prohibitions that will de-incentivize occupations and wars of aggression. And one of those major prohibitions is you cannot buy or acquire sovereignty through force. And that is exactly what Israel is doing. It has annexed East Jerusalem. There's no question Israel openly declares it, but it is in the process of annexing Area C and the West Bank. So that's the second assertion by the court. The third one, and probably the most damning one, the one that is an embarrassing and shameful for us as Israelis, definitely for us as Jews, is that the court has reached the conclusion that the character of the Israeli regime created in the West Bank is one that is violating Article 3 of the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Article 2 says that racial discrimination is wrong, is forbidden. Article 3 says that the most abhorrent types of racial discrimination are racial segregation and apartheid. And the court, in a majority of 12-3, says this is a case of racial segregation and apartheid. And then the courts in their separate statements each says which of them. Some say actually it's apartheid, some say it's only racial segregation. So these are extremely damning assertions. And then the court goes on, and here is the answer to your question, how significant it is. Then the court goes on and says, well, the UN, the international community as a whole, and every member state has a duty, an obligation to review its relationship with Israel, all its economic, trade, scientific, whatever, relations with Israel, and make sure that none of them provides assistance or support to the Israeli illegal presence or lawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. That's much more than a geographic clause in a treaty saying this treaty only applies in the Green Line. That's much more, because Israel is unifying its public institutions in the West Bank and in Israel. So from now on, and as we speak, hundreds, maybe thousands of legal advisors around the world are writing legal reports that would interpret this ruling, this advisory opinion, to their bosses, the executives, the governments, the legislators, and judges would also have to interpret it and ask themselves how us as a state, Belgium, France, UK, even the United States, how can we make sure that we are not contributing to this unlawful situation? And I didn't even start to talk about the implications of arrest warrants if issued against Netanyahu and Gallant. I only will say that already, by actually just alleging these crimes, by the way, the prosecutor did not allege genocide. He alleged extermination, and extermination, which means mass killing, and use of starvation as a method of war, to a war crime and a crime against humanity, extermination. By only alleging this, already it has implications on the arms trade with Israel by its allies. So to sum it up, we have a new figure in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's international law. Law usually should help those who are weaker, those who do not have the military or economic or political power. And I hope that would be the result of those proceedings, which we'll see proliferating in coming weeks and months.
I'll just say what I always say to you, Michael, which is that I'm just glad that my grandparents are not alive to see this happening. You mentioned what it feels like as Jews to be.
I only want to say, I come from a Holocaust surviving family. My parents were in totalitarian Poland until '68, and they moved here both because of here to Israel, both because of the anti-Semitism that was prevailing in Poland and because of the history of our people. And my parents are now asking themselves, what did we do? Why did we grow our children in a place that becomes more and more like the places we ran away from.
So what are we going to do about this, Yehuda?
We'll win.
I know, but what is it really going to mean to stop the annexation and to stop this? What are the levers that can be pulled in general and in particular in the US? And then I'm going to bring Rabbi Sharon Brous on to help us also reflect on this as American Jews and as Americans more specifically. So Yehuda, nobody knows levers and pulling them like you do. So tell us what's being done and what needs to be done.
Just being conscious of the time, so I'll try to be very short and quick, but just to say, inside Israel, I'll just double down on one thing that Noa rightly so put kind of like a spotlight on, was the fact that the judicial overall, a big part of the forces, the tailwind of that attempt or of that ideology is the settlements and the attempt to pursue full, complete annexation, as this government is doing. I think before October 7, we started to see a growing realization within the protest movement against the judicial overall, that a lot of what people are protesting against, a lot of what we are facing as Israelis is, I'll use the phrase, is made in Judea and Samaria, so to speak. It's basically settlement products. Yeah, this is something that comes from the hilltops of the West Bank into Israel. And in a way, Israel is on this crossroad. Will we remain a country that has an occupation and a settlement enterprise, or a settlement enterprise that has a country? Yeah, that's kind of like the crossroad that we are now in. Obviously, October 7 has changed a bit that conversation and realization. But I think I would argue that it's just even more clear now. And we can see the kind of forces in the government that are pursuing permanent war and want and willing to sacrifice the hostages. And I think the word sacrifice is the right word to use here in this context. Because for people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, that is the idea. Yeah, the Israeli hostages in Gaza should be sacrificed for permanent rule, resettlement, forced migration, and basically complete vision of apartheid. And I think that also is something that we in Israel need to do, to link and do this connection for people here to understand how these issues all come together.
Thanks, Yehuda. Rabbi Sharon, I want to turn to you and welcome you and thank you for joining this call and for being just such a North Star for so many of us during these times and during all times. What have you been thinking and doing, and what guidance can you give us about how we can show up to use our voices and platforms to contribute to the efforts to block annexation?
Thank you, Libby. I'll speak very briefly because I know we're at the end of the hour here. But first of all, it's been an incredible honor to hear the four of you speak for this past hour. And I'm so deeply grateful and so moved to see so many people who are here with us. I was with Yehuda and Mickey over the summer, and we went to several of these Palestinian villages that have been essentially destroyed over the course of the past year. And to see it live is incredibly moving. And I hope anyone who's on this call who is planning a trip to Israel will also take the time to go and actually see and bear witness yourselves to what's actually unfolding in the West Bank. I'm just listening to you thinking about that eternal tension between Yerushalayim Shel Mala and Yerushalayim Shel Mata, this vision of a kind of dream of Yerushalayim and of Israel, really, in which there's this heavenly vision where there's no suffering and there's only peace and possibility, versus the vision of the real, actual, on the ground reality, which is very messy and immense suffering and very problematic. And the tension is to try to bring these two very different conversations into one honest discourse. And so we have here many diaspora Jews who are truly deeply invested in Israel's future, but who continue to hold on to a kind of Pollyannish view of Israel that's really wedded to the rhetoric of Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. And in order to do so, have to block out voices like the voices of the four of yours versus the four of you, who are also deeply committed to Israel's future and respond with a kind of clear-eyed, honest, urgent reflection of the reality on the ground. What you're saying is very hard for anyone who cares about Israel to hear, and is essential for anyone who cares about the future of Israel and the future of the Middle East to hear. And so I believe that our work really as diaspora Jews and people who are invested in Israel's future is to help share the burden of this sense of urgency, to respond to this ultra-nationalist, hardline, messianic regime that is intent on eviscerating Israel's democracy by supporting the force on the ground represented by all of you that's really fighting for a different future. For all the people who put into the Q&A, how can we help? How can we help? You know how you can help. When we're silent, we are supporting the force that is working to eviscerate democracy that is causing great harm on the ground. When we actively platform and amplify and support the voices of the people that we've heard from today, we become an effective force that is fighting for democracy and that is fighting for human rights, that's fighting for Israel's future. The way we can respond is by supporting the New Israel Fund, which is helping to platform and amplify and support the voice of the people you've heard today. I hope that you will do that. I take this as a very serious imperative for us as diaspora Jews. If we say we care about Israel's future, let's show that we care by actually supporting the people on the ground who are doing the work to protect that future. Thank you so much to all of you for your work.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for the endorsement and for those moving words. I also want to recommend that people, if you haven't already, you should read Rabbi Sharon's book, The Amen Effect. It's a balm in this time, and actually a very practical tool for how to do some of this. And I also want to recommend Michael Sfard's book, The Wall and the Gate, which is a hefty walkthrough of how these issues have played out through strategic litigation that Michael has done and through the courts of law, and definitely worth the read. We're going to make the recording of this webinar available and send around the report that I referenced at the beginning of the 4 groups about the far right and their efforts towards annexation. New Israel Fund has always and will continue to support Israelis working to ensure human rights, freedom, and dignity for all people. This is not a radical concept. It's a very basic concept that we have always believed, will continue to believe with all of your support. I really want to thank our 3 speakers and Rabbi Sharon for being with us today to unpack this. We're trying to, walk the talk, or, we're saying this is being underemphasized when all eyes are somewhere else. And so hopefully our eyes and minds and ears and hearts were with all of you in understanding what's happening in the West Bank. I hope we can all find the right platforms to talk about this in our upcoming holidays, in our upcoming elections. New Israel Fund is a 501c3, but hopefully we'll see Rabbi Sharon as part of an inauguration in 2025, as we did some years ago with President Obama. We look forward to your voice guiding us towards that, and once we reach it. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to being together as a community commemorating the 1-year anniversary on October 7th as well.
Thank you very much.